Morning. We are here together to remember and celebrate the life of Eric Blaustein. His death saddens us all, but the pain is felt most keenly by his children, Tammy Bob and Odette Blaustein, as well as his sisters, Hannah Smith and the late Eleanor Krongold. We also remember Eric's wife, the late Sipi Blaustein. We direct our sympathy and support to them first and foremost, but we also comfort each other. We extend condolences to Eric's son-in-law, Rabbi Stephen Bob, and daughter-in-law, Ziva Blaustein, and we remember Eric's late brothers-in-law, Dr. David Krongold and Rabbi H.D. Uriel Smith. We also extend condolences to Eric's grandchildren and their spouses, Lisa Kaplan Bob and Jeffrey Kaplan, Abby and Asaf Nagola, Gideon and Molly Bob, the late Aviad Blaustein, and Eran and Michal Blaustein, as well as to Eric's great-grandchildren, Nat, Ethan, and Julia Howard, Kira and Jonah Bob, Naama, Talia, and Ayala Nagola, and Devir, Hila, and Adva Blaustein. And we share our condolences with Eric's extended family and friends, both who are here in person and those who are joining us via the live stream. Today we mourn one who no longer walks among the living. With Eric's death, there is a loss, an emptiness, a void which will never again be filled. When he was born, the world was transformed. His life graced our world and enriched it. With his death just days ago, that unique person is no longer, and again, our world has been transformed. We look to the words of our tradition to begin to help us understand just how much our world was transformed by Eric's presence. Birth is a beginning and death a destination, and life is a journey from childhood to maturity and youth to age, from innocence to awareness and ignorance to knowing, from foolishness to discretion and then perhaps to wisdom, from weakness to strength or strength to weakness and often back again, from health to sickness and back we pray to health again, from offense to forgiveness, from loneliness to love, from joy to gratitude, from pain to compassion and grief to understanding, from fear to faith, from defeat to defeat to defeat, until looking backward or ahead, we see that victory lies not at some high place along the way, but in having made this journey stage by stage, a sacred pilgrimage. Birth is a beginning and death a destination, and life is a journey, a sacred pilgrimage to life everlasting. A reading from Kohelet. L'chol zman ve'et l'chol chefetz tachat hashamayim, et laledet ve'et lamut, et lata'at ve'et la'akor natua, et laharog ve'et lirpo, et lifrotz ve'et livnot, et livkot ve'et lischok, et zifod ve'et rakod, et lehashlich avanim ve'et knos avanim, et lehavok ve'et lirchok mechabek, et levakesh ve'et le'abed, et lishmor ve'et lehashlich, et likra ve'et litpor, et lechashot ve'et ladaber, et le'ahov ve'et lisno, et milchama ve'et shalom. There is a time for everything, a time for every experience under heaven, a time for being born and a time for dying, a time for planting and a time for being planted, uprooting the planted, a time for destroying and a time for healing, a time for tearing down and a time for building up, a time for weeping and a time for laughing, a time for wailing and a time for dancing, a time for throwing stones and a time for gathering stones, a time for embracing and a time for refraining from embraces, a time for seeking and a time for losing, a time for keeping and a time for discarding, a time for tearing and a time for sowing, a time for silence and a time for speaking, a time for loving and a time for hating, a time for war and a time for peace. In a moment, I'm going to say Psalm 23. I'll read it first in Hebrew, and then I'll invite you to say it with me in the English if you know the words. Adonai ro'i lo echsar, bin ot deshe yarbitzeni, al me menuchot yanachaleni, nafshi yeshovev, yanache b'maglei tzedek lema'an shemo, gam ki el begeit salmavet, lo irara ki ata imadi, shivtecha umishantecha hema yanachamuni, ta'aroch lefanai shulchan neged sorarai, deshanta v'shemen roshi, kosi rivaya. Ach tov v'chesed yerdefuni kol yamei chayai, v'shavti beveit Adonai le'orech yamim. Adonai is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside still waters. He restoreth my soul. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thine have set a table before my enemies in the presence of my enemies. You have anointed my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of God forever. It is a fearful thing to love what death can touch. A fearful thing to love, to hope, to dream, to be, and to lose. A thing for fools this, and a holy things to love. For your life has lived in me, your laugh once lifted me, your word was gift to me. To remember this brings a painful joy. 'Tis a human thing, love, a holy thing, to love what death has touched. Esainai el heharim, me'ayin yavo Ezri. Ezri me'im Adonai osei shamayim va'aretz. Al yitain lamrot raglecha va'al yanum shomrecha. Hine lo yanum velo yishan shomer Yisrael. Adonai shomrecha, Adonai tzilcha al yad yaminecha. Yomam hashemesh lo yakeka ve'areach balayla. Adonai yishmorcha mikol ra, yishmor et nafshecha. Adonai yishmor tzedcha uvoecha, me'ata ve'ad olam. A song of ascents. I turn my eyes to the mountains. From where will my help come? My help will come from Adonai, maker of heaven and earth. God will not let your foot give way. Your guardian will not slumber. See, the guardian of Israel neither slumbers nor sleeps. Adonai is your guardian. Adonai is your protection at your right hand. By day the sun will not strike you, nor the moon by night. Adonai will guard you from all harm. God will guard your life. Adonai will guard your going and coming now and forever. At this time, we are going to hear from some of Eric's family so that they can share about his life and his legacy. And it's my privilege to first invite up Tammy Bob, Eric's daughter.
Thank you all for being here. It's a great comfort. You know, if you live to a very old age, say 98 years old, one downside is that almost nobody can remember you not being old. So I'm in a not unique, but almost unique position. I remember being 3 years old and being on my 30-year-old dad's shoulders and running through a field in a park. And I was on top of the world. And that is one way I like to remember him. He lived all the stages of his life with purpose and drive. Most of you have heard him speak about his childhood and teenage years in Nazi Germany. He talked about his transformation from a 5-year-old German patriot to an outcast refugee on the run, ending with a dramatic stay in a concentration camp. If this is new to you, I would be happy to share his very detailed memoirs of this early part of his life. What we can learn from this story is that having a network of friends and family outside your small community, in his case, the Jewish community, can save your life. The war ended when he was 18, and my father, with strong prodding from his parents, entered the University of Wittenberg to study engineering. He was not particularly enamored with the prospect of being an engineer, but he was mathematically inclined, a problem solver, good with his hands. He had very precise handwriting and good drawing skills. One problem was that his formal education ended in the 8th grade, after which Nazis didn't allow Jews to go to school, not even a Jewish school. My father had cobbled an education from literature he read while in hiding, and math instruction he received in his early teens from a fellow prisoner on a forced labor factory line. Once he started university, some of his classmates, most who had been German soldiers the year before, helped him catch up in math. A degree in engineering was a way to rejoin society, that is, earn a steady living, marry, raise a family. But his real interest was archaeology, especially biblical archaeology. That would have required years of study with uncertain prospects. And after so many years of uncertain prospects, he wanted stability. He definitely didn't want to stay in Germany, though, because it had treated him so badly. So a month after graduating with his engineering degree, he was off to the recently created state of Israel. This was in 1948. There he was immediately conscripted into a German-speaking Palmach unit, that's an elite Israeli army unit, and sent to the Negev to fight Egyptians. This is the period of which he was proudest all his life. Once again, he was facing death, but this time he was in combat, commanding others as a lieutenant. His unit helped liberate Beersheba and saw fierce action in the Battle of Hulaikat, which he mentioned often because his helmet was dinged by a bullet just at the rim. That was a close brush. This was also the time when he met my mother, who was a fetching secretary in a command office. The story is that they took an instant dislike to each other. My father had shown up directly from battle with a message for one of the commanders, and my soon-to-be mother told him he'd better shower first. She won that argument, like many, many subsequent ones, and their love affair began. They were married for over 60 years. After he was out of the army, my dad had a hard time finding work in the new but economically moribund Israel. And even more disturbing, they were living in a small 3-bedroom apartment with my widowed grandmother, my aunt, her husband, 3 small children. There were no apartments for my parents to rent in a country swarming with new immigrants. Yes, in Israel. So my parents decided to go to Germany, an odd decision, but it was where my father could work and they would wait for immigration papers to the US. There was a surprise that year, me. I believe I may have been the only Jewish child born in Germany that year, so soon after the end of the Holocaust. My father described how he raced his motorcycle back from work when he got the news of my birth. I still have a hard time picturing my dad, the most cautious of drivers, as a motorcycle guy. And no, back then, I don't think anybody wore helmets. Next, my parents became American immigrants, first stop Brooklyn, New York. My dad found a job right away, and that was a first step towards what he called having it made. You know, I really don't know where and how he learned English, but his English was very good. I have asked him about this, but I never got a satisfactory answer, so I guess that's going to remain a mystery. My parents arrived with very little money, and at first they lived in an apartment with a bed, 1 chair, and a table. I don't know where I slept. One of their neighbors told them that to truly adjust to the new country, the most important purchase they could make was the newly invented television. So before I had a crib, we had a television. Over the next few years, my father got steady promotions and a good offer in Cleveland, where we moved when I was 4. After his Palmach military service, his rise in the corporate engineering world was probably his second proudest achievement. After all, he was a Jew in a field only recently open to Jews in the United States, and he spoke with a pronounced German accent that he never lost. This led to some funny stories. For example, when business took him to Alabama, he was convinced that people mistook his accent for a typical Yankee one. He did not like when other German speakers tried to engage him in German. He didn't want to identify with that country in any way. It took many years for him to accept that often people could recognize his German origins, and that was just how it was. Nor was he eager to associate with other Holocaust survivors. When I was older and learned about a survivor group in our community, I asked him why he didn't join. "I don't see myself as a victim," he said. "I want to forget about that time as much as I can." He did pursue other interests. He became president of a Jewish engineering society. He took classes at Case Western Reserve in his true passion, history and archaeology. He and my mother frequently attended concerts, opera, and theater. Probably the apex of his professional life was obtaining a U.S. patent on a system for lignite pelletization, which I don't really understand. But it has to do with a cleaner coal alternative. I'm sure somebody in this room, Paul Farber is nodding his head, okay. So this process took him all over the world, to Europe and the Far East. This was really a great time for him. He was just at the cusp of selling the process to a big corporation when Reagan was elected, and the push towards alternate forms of energy halted, just like that. All the funding was gone. But by then, my dad was close to retirement. When he did retire, and my parents were living in Pittsburgh by then, he volunteered 3 days a week at the Carnegie Museum in their natural history department, where the faculty of archaeologists soon discovered his ability to rebuild sherds into recognizable pottery, and his amazing breadth and depth of knowledge of the field. Over the years, he had occasionally met prominent archaeologists in various places. Most recently, he met a member of the Wheaton College faculty. Anyhow, these people were always awed by how well he knew his stuff, and he was so proud of this. This was probably his third favorite achievement. At some point during this period, he began to talk about his early life during the Holocaust, a topic he had kept under wraps until then. I first learned about the Holocaust in Sunday school when I was in 3rd grade, and I realized that my parents had been Jews in Europe during that period, my dad in Germany itself. But when I asked him about it, he gave non-committal non-answers and changed the subject. My mother told me that no one in America wanted to hear about those bad times, and neither should I. But I credit Steven Spielberg with my father's change in attitude. When Schindler's List came out, there was a sudden interest in survivors and their stories. In response, Spielberg funded a project to send film crews and interviewers anywhere there were survivors to document their experiences in great detail. The films are typically 4 to 5 hours long and done with great care. I was surprised my dad agreed to participate in this, but who wouldn't want to be filmed by Steven Spielberg? Holocaust survivors also became in demand as speakers for middle schools and high schools and all sorts of organizations. So my father began speaking while still in Pittsburgh, and after moving to Chicago, he was in great demand as a Holocaust speaker here. He was very good at this. His talks were organized, clear, and unemotional, but gripping. Some of his regular gigs included the Chicago Police Academy and several teacher in-service days. He was imported to Milwaukee and Peoria, among other places, and sometimes he made it on the local TV news. He was proud that at his increasingly advanced age, he could still do something relevant. After my mother died 11 years ago, my father quickly found a different kind of companion at Beacon Hill, where he lived. What were the odds that a woman with a PhD in Catholic theology, with deep interest in biblical history, European history, and even archaeology would live in the same retirement community as my dad? It was 100% in that case. Although he and Jean Fergal had many disagreements, they shared the same esoteric interests, and she was a great comfort to my father the past 11 years, until she too passed away a few months ago. But in the end, his greatest delight was to see his grandchildren with solid, happy lives, and 11 thriving great-grandchildren. Some live in Israel, and he didn't see them so much, but all were precious to him, clear evidence that he had prevailed against the Nazis' plans for him. I have always seen my father as an heroic figure, and he will long be remembered by the many people whose lives he touched.
My visits with Papa always began with him telling me how old and weak he had become. He would repeat the line, "An old man shouldn't be born." After our meal, he would drive his wheelchair back to his apartment door, where at 98 years old, he would pull himself up by the door handle, walk the door open, kick down the door stop, walk back to his wheelchair, and sit down. Papa was my grandfather for 40 years, but it was in these last 3 years that I became closest to him. This was born out of practicality. He needed help, and I had the time to offer it. Each winter, I bought him groceries, only the essentials: eggs, cotto salami, and canned herring. Then we would have a meal together, mostly at Juicio, and Papa would tell me stories. Here's one of his favorites. Here's one of my favorites, one I heard many times. During the Israeli War of Independence, when Papa fought in the Palmach, they were fighting the Egyptians in the desert, and for 3 days they were at a standstill. They were shooting back and forth with neither side making progress. Finally, Papa's unit made a big charge, and the Egyptians just ran away. When the Israelis got to the Egyptian bunker, they found cans of unlabeled meat. And all the soldiers were so hungry, they just started eating, except for 2 soldiers who kept strictly kosher. It just so happened that a very important rabbi was stationed with the unit. When he caught up to the troops and saw the 2 not eating, he asked why. They told him, and he said, "You haven't eaten in how long? 3 days? So it's kosher, eat, go on." Papa would always add the kicker that they did later find out it was camel. Now, this is a classic Papa story. It has all the essential elements. First of all, it's funny. Papa could have told very serious stories, but he preferred the funny ones. There's also a fool who doesn't quite understand their situation. And there's also an explanation of success. This last piece, why some people succeeded while others did not, was omnipresent in Papa's stories. This question clearly comes out of his remarkable life. He had a lot of success to try to explain. Papa thought the world of me. I'm only now realizing what a gift that was. He called me Yidon, the Hebrew pronunciation of my name. As a teenager, I heard this pronunciation as a distance, a signal of being misunderstood. But in these recent years, it became a closeness. It brought me closer to Papa's world, which really was a different world than mine. Just as all Jews are taught that we were there at Sinai when Moses received the Torah, I feel as I was there in the desert fighting the Egyptians. This feeling is partly buoyed by the physical resemblance I share with my grandfather. I've seen photographs from this time, and I have to remind myself it is not me actually there in the pictures. Papa loved to dwell on the physical resemblances of the generations. As new children were born into our family, like his great-grandchildren, Kira and Jonah, he took great pleasure in finding a chin or an eye that reminded him of various aunts and uncles from generations past. As a young man, the most serious threats were made on Papa's life. That he succeeded in surviving was a miracle in search of an explanation. The many lives that have sprung forth from that success is beyond even the search.
Now I'd like to invite up Eric's son-in-law, Rabbi Stephen Bob.
I have some messages from members of the family to share. Eric's son, Oded, who lives in Jerusalem, wrote the following. A short ode of farewell to my father, Eric Blaustein. My father was like a time machine. While H.G. Wells' hero fought the Malachs, my father fought the Nazis of Hitler's Germany. Thanks to his victory, with him the Holocaust was personal. The world was a better place. After a few years of studying engineering, he arrived in Israel to fight in Israel's independence war. The combined armies of Iraq, Egypt, and Transjordan were no match for him. And soon the biblical city of the patriarch Abraham, Beersheba, was once again in Jewish hands. After a difficult jeep ride through the Arava desert, a few months later, my father and Israel reached the Red Sea. The patriotic Israeli portrait equivalent of the Spirit of 76, the flag hoisting at Rashrash, soon to become Eilat, includes a tall, lanky Eric Blaustein. Years after biblical archaeology became his passion, while his exploits never quite rivaled Indiana Jones, he did make neat replicas of biblical artifacts for all his family. Dad took great pride in his family. Every child, grandchild, great-grandchild was proof that somehow, against all odds, he had survived and lived a long and happy life. May his offspring and their family be blessed and keep his legacy with pride and dignity. In the name of Eric's family in Israel, we thank you for honoring my father today. With love and honor, Oded Blaustein. Two of Oded's grandchildren, Eric's great-grandchildren, have wrote a line of memory. Gila writes, Papa haya saba rabba madhim. Papa was a wonderful great-grandfather. I enjoyed being with him. I will remember him in my heart. I always think of him when I see my mechanical cat that I received from Papa when we visited him. He will remain with me always. Dvir writes, Ani shomer tamid ekol habrachot shekibalti me Papa. I will always remember all the blessings I received from Papa. They will be with me forever. A few years ago, Eric spoke at Deerfield High School. Eric's oldest grandchild, Nat, describes the reaction of the students. Papa was a celebrity at my high school. People were taking selfies with him when he shared his story. It was an impactful experience. Eric's nephew, Mani Enzer, also from Israel, writes, "He was a very significant family member for me during my entire life. In 1966, he was the uncle who came to Israel to help me and my 47 Frischman Street family cope with my father's sudden death, when my twin brother Ronnie and I were 14 years old. He was the uncle who, together with my aunt Tsippi, gave me the feeling of wellness and confidence when I was in the United States as a student in 1981 and 1982. I also want to share a few of my own thoughts. Papa was the most educated person I knew. And I know a lot of people who think they're educated. He knew the geography of the world. He could recite poems in 3 languages. He could confidently write in Paleo-Hebrew. He had deep knowledge of the history of Europe and the history of the ancient Middle East. He could talk confidently about the ancient Hittites and about European wars. He had tremendous recall of detail. A few years ago, I asked him about a king who had been mentioned in a novel I was reading. The king was Augustus the Strong, who I had never heard of. Papa knew all about Augustus the Strong, the king of Poland. He explained to me that he was not just the king of Poland, but he was also the elector of Saxony. He told me that Augustus the Strong did not live in Warsaw, but rather chose to live in Dresden, as any cultured person would choose to do. Papa had golden hands. He could fix anything. 41 years ago, when Tammy was pregnant, expecting our twins, he decided that she should not have to lift the garage door. So he bought us a garage door opener. And then he installed it himself. When we decided to finish the basement in our old house, Papa did the wiring. Papa built a big wooden truck that our kids could play in. It was a sturdy toy. Our children loved playing in it, and the next generation has loved playing in it. It remains a sturdy toy. As Tammy mentioned, Papa spoke about the Holocaust to many groups. I often drove him to these events. He easily adjusted to his audience. For 8th graders in Villa Park, or Wheaton College students, or a group of Chicago rabbis, he understood how to shape his presentation to fit the audience. I heard the presentation many, many times. He joked that I was able to give it if need be. It was never exactly the same. He never tried to shock his listeners with gory details. He told his firsthand story of the step-by-step advance of the Nazi anti-Jewish program and how it played out in his specific life. During his presentation, he used humor to relieve tension. I always enjoyed the Luigi story. Like many of us, me included, Eric could repeat stories. Tammy and I often took Papa out for dinner on Sunday evenings. One of our regular places has a particular fish dish on the menu that Tammy enjoys. Every time Tammy ordered it, Papa would tell a story about the first time he had that particular fish dish in Marseille when he was on his way to Israel in 1948. Tammy stopped ordering the dish in order to avoid prompting Eric to tell the story. After a while, I explained to Eric that Tammy was not ordering what she really wanted in order to avoid having to hear the story again. Papa agreed to refrain from telling that story. A few months later, when Tammy ordered the dish, Papa sheepishly asked, "Could he tell the story just one more time?" Many people have stepped up to be helpful. Our children, Lisa, Abby, and Gideon, their spouses, Jeffrey, Molly, and Asaf, all have done their part in supporting Papa. And our grandchildren, Papa's great-grandchildren, brought joy to Papa even in his last weeks. I also want to thank Amy Allen and Lorna Helgeland for regularly visiting Eric. He looked forward to your stopping by to see him. Eric was a hero of the Jewish people, but the hero of the Eric saga is Tammy. Tammy cared for her father in so many ways for so many years. You've heard of concierge medicine? Tammy was Eric's concierge. She did everything that needed to be done. She was his advocate, his main support. I used to joke that her main hobby was taking her father to doctor's appointments. She even provided tech support. We would get calls, "Someone has taken over my computer," or "the internet was down." Really, we were impressed that Papa in his 90s had become so involved with the use of the computer. But he did need tech support. Eric lived a long and full life. He lived on his own until early January of this year. On January 1st, the last night of Hanukkah, he sat in our house, surrounded by our full family, singing Hanukkah songs. In one of those songs, we proclaimed, "Kain b'chol dor yakum hagibor goel ha'am." In every generation, a hero arises who saves the people. Eric often described himself as an ordinary man who lived in extraordinary times. In truth, he was an extraordinary person. I saw him as a hero who did his part to save the Jewish people.
God heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds. God reckons the number of stars, giving each one its name. Great and full of power is God, whose wisdom is beyond reckoning. God gives courage to the lowly and brings hope to the bereft. So may God always be with us. I invite you now to please rise as we recite El Malei Rachamim. El Malei Rachamim, Shochen Bamromim, Chamsei Menucha Nechona, Tachat Kanfei HaShchina, Im Kedoshim Otohorim, Kezohar Haraki HaMazhirim, Et Nishmat Eliyahu ben Tuvia Elishava, שהלך לעולמו. בעל הרחמים יסתירהו, בסתר כנפיו לעולמים, ויצרור בצרור החיים את נשמתו. אדוני הוא נחלתו, וינוח בשלום על משכבו, ונאמר Amen. Fully compassionate God on high, to our loved one Eric Blaustein, who has entered eternity, grant him clear and certain rest with you in the lofty heights of the sacred and pure, whose brightness shines like the very glow of heaven. Source of mercy, forever enfold him in the embrace of your wings. Secure his soul in eternity. Adonai, he is yours. May he rest in peace. Amen. Please be seated.
We are going to conclude the services at Jewish Oak Ridge Cemetery in Hillside, about a 20-25-minute ride in procession. Those of you who will not be going to the cemetery, we ask that you leave the sanctuary and immediately go to your cars and leave the parking area. Those of you who will be going to the cemetery in procession, we ask that when you leave the sanctuary, you go immediately to your cars. Make sure you have a sticker and flag on your car. We want you to turn your headlights on. Manually turn them on like we used to do in the old days, not just when you start the engine. Turn your headlights on as well as your emergency flashers, and stay in front of you as close as you can to avoid gaps and spaces. The Shiva will be private, and the following people have been asked and given the privilege of being a pallbearer. When I call your name, I'm going to ask you to please rise and meet us in the center aisle. Lisa Kaplan Bob, Jeffrey Kaplan, Gideon Bob, Molly Bob, Ethan Howard, and Julia Howard. The rest of the congregation, I'll ask you to rise in silent prayer as we escort the casket from the sanctuary.